I have about 4 more slides, and it's 6:15, and I know we're probably, I don't know, people are getting tired. I have an example of a qualitative exam question that I wrote for my Intro to Environmental Science students at Dartmouth, most of whom are first or second year students. And it asked them about bottled water. So here's a question, and again, it shows how you can do it qualitatively and then qualitatively. So I have this thing where people send in questions to a blog, and students on their exam have to type in Twitter or write on the page of the written exam, but it's like a short answer. My environmental friends tell me that drinking bottled water is bad for the environment. I don't understand. I know that bottled water is clean, so it must be good for me, right? And I always recycle my plastic water bottles, so what's the problem? And I'm telling the student identify 2 different problems. So one way to qualitatively answer this is to say it takes energy, mostly oil, to manufacture a plastic bottle, fill it with water, and then it takes a great deal of energy to transport bottled water to stores and to consumers, especially when you compare this quantity of energy to the minimal amounts needed to obtain the same volume of water from the faucet. And this answer assumes that the water from your faucet is clean and safe to drink, and that's not true everywhere in the world, and that's not true in certain parts of this country. There's no guarantee that bottled water is any cleaner than your tap water. So I like questions like this because, one, it's a qualitative way to get someone to do a life cycle analysis. It also reaches across many parts of the Acorn Guide or many parts of your course. So it's talking about energy, it's talking about life cycle and assessment, but it's also talking about water. Where does water come from? What does water quality mean? And so you can get to a lot of different things with an answer like that. A second answer might be that plastic water bottles, once used, can become a solid waste problem if they're disposed of in landfills. They can become a plastic pollution problem, potentially endangering wildlife, ending up in the ocean perhaps, if not disposed of properly. And even if recycled, they require energy to transport and recycle. And furthermore, they're typically not part of a closed-loop recycling process, right? We often learn that things like plastic soda bottles and water bottles may become carpeting or polar fleece or polyester leisure suits. I don't know why, but my class always cracks up when I mention polyester leisure suits. But, it very rarely is a closed-loop recycling process. So that's the kind of thing that one could answer that question qualitatively. And then here's one, when I talk about food miles and carbon miles in my class, when I talk about energy and when I talk about food, I use some real data. I found out how many water bottles the Dartmouth Dining Service cafeterias bought last year. It was 600,000 water bottles. And I made the assumption they were 1-liter plastic bottles, and 1 liter weighs 1 kilogram when it's full of water, and I assume they were brought by truck, an average of 100 miles from a bottling plant to Dartmouth, I don't know, in Massachusetts somewhere. And I used some numbers, and I'm not going to go through it now because we're heading towards 6:20, but here is, I think, a fun kind of little exercise to get someone to appreciate how much energy in joules was needed to move water bottles to Dartmouth from Massachusetts or wherever they were, and how many liters of fuel did that take. And so I've given you the solution here. And so there was 7,200 liters, and 83 bottles is how much is transported by 1 liter of diesel fuel, just to get those bottles 100 miles. So those are some things, and I think what they point to, and again, I did, right before I did take a sip of water from my little glass bottle here, and it's not necessarily that drinking water out of plastic bottles is bad, but in a qualitative way here, and in a quantitative way here, you can allow your students to do the actual calculations to make the point that we don't necessarily know what the answer is, and then if you start by comparing it to something else, like what's the energy involved in turning on your tap and filling up a reusable container with water, well, one thing that the really astute student will bring up is, but wait a minute, how much energy did it take to build that water infrastructure? And that's a really great question. And how much energy did it take to put in the copper pipes and plumbing to get the faucet in your house? And so one way to do it is to say, once the water infrastructure is in, what's the trade-off in energy use to get your water one way versus the other? Or another one, it would be really hard to do, is to try to figure out, how much energy went into the water infrastructure. Those are the kinds of things you can do with life cycle assessment. And one of the philosophies in our book is not to tell people that water bottles are bad, but rather to let them look at the situation, look at the facts, and in a, I hope, relatively dispassionate way, come up. I should just point out that this was an exam question I wrote, and I don't think this exact material is in the textbook anywhere. And this is also something that I've recently written with all these discussions about food miles and carbon miles. But I bring them up as examples of things you can do with your students that allow them to participate and be doing life cycle assessment and come up with either qualitative and or quantitative responses to questions that you or they may pose. So as I mentioned at the beginning, this is the first year that our book was used in large numbers of schools around the country. And I just got this email the other day from Kathy, who said in Colorado, who said it would be okay to use her last name, but I didn't want to because she did write at the first. Last year, my class pass rate was below the national average, and I felt I had let my students down. And I just got this email yesterday or the day before, and I asked her today if it was okay to show it to all of you. I was lucky enough to be able to adopt your new text this year, and I used it with one class. I taught it cover to cover. I appreciated the parallel structure with the ACORN objectives provided by College Board. You saw I showed you that in the table of contents. Thank you for a wonderful textbooks. My kids completed every multiple choice question at the end of each chapter, and the students, after taking the exam, told her that these were helpful. My students also completed every measure your impact, and the teacher said, I appreciated the applied calculation practice in every chapter. So that's the kind of feedback we're getting, and it seems that whatever textbook you use, or if you don't use a textbook, I think it's really important to come up with qualitative and quantitative assessments of the different systems. If you can connect different systems, that's really valuable, and getting your students to do the calculations is turning out to be, in most cases, really, really valuable. And as we mentioned right before we got started, the chief reader for the APES exam, and of course this isn't the only motivation for teaching our students and letting them understand this information, but he said at the AP annual a couple of years ago, I heard him say, the best student, if they don't have the numerical literacy, is probably not going to do better than a 4 on the exam. So that is, you cannot get a 5 without having proficiency in manipulating the numbers that are going to appear in at least one, if not more, of the free response questions. So that's really the end of my prepared material. I wanted to point out that I've been having some wonderful dialogues with some of you. I certainly recognized Chris and Julie. I had met in person very early on when AP Environmental Science got started, and I recognized some other names on here, including Nat Draper, who's worked quite effectively with our teacher's resource binder, which I hope you can see here, which, depending on the number of textbooks you order, you can either get this for free or you may have to pay for it. But I've had a really great dialogue with a number of you, so I'd really encourage you, andy.friedland@dartmouth.edu, send me an email. We do have, I've been not working on it enough probably, but we do have a Facebook page, Friedland and Relyea Environmental Science for AP, where I post things that I think are interesting, and sometimes we get into a discussion with a bunch of the people. I mean, I think we have something like 45 likes, so it's not exactly one of the largest pages out there. But anyway, I'd encourage you to take a look if you get a chance. And it's now 6:24, 6:25, and Cindy is on the line as well with her microphone on. But Cindy, maybe we could see if people have a few questions or comments.
Sure, absolutely. If anybody wants to go. You can raise your hand and I can unmute you, or if you feel more comfortable typing it into the chat box, I can read your question for Andy to answer. While you're typing or raising your hand, one thing I wondered was if anybody's going to be at the AP reading next month in Cincinnati. Any of you APES readers?
Great
Show of hands.
Question. Oh, good.
Okay.
Nat's going to be there?